Hi everyone. In this video we're going to start with the basics of pedigree analysis skills. And this video will cover autosomal dominant and recessive mutations. Okay, so here's a pedigree to remind you. The squares are males and biological males, and the circles are females. So we're looking at a trait here called brachydactyly, which is shortness of the fingers and toes. And so go ahead and pause if you want to kind of guess at what might be going on here between brachydactyly and non-brachydactyly in this in this family, and then we'll continue with it. Okay, so let's go through what we expect for a dominant trait. Okay, so for a dominant trait, if we have an individual who is affected with the dominant autosomal trait, well, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that the individual has at least one dominant, in this case big A allele, and that tells us that this individual has to have inherited it from one of the parents. So we're excluding the possibility of de novo or somatic mutations here, in which case this individual has to have inherited it from one parent. So it could either come through the mom, in which case the mom must carry the dominant allele and should also carry the trait, or it has to come through the dad, right? So there's only two ways this individual could have gotten this big A. It either has to come down through the egg or through the sperm, so should have either an affected mother or an affected father. So one of the two parents must be affected. Well, let's think about, so let's go back to the pedigree here. And does that actually apply in this case? Well, for each affected individual, we want to ask, does that individual have an affected parent? This individual has an affected father, actually both affected mother and father, an affected father and an affected mother. So what we can say about this trait is, yes, it is consistent with dominant, and in fact, what scientists have worked out is that that trait is in fact inherited in a dominant manner. Okay, let's look at another trait here. We're looking at black wool versus white wool in sheep. And we want to ask, what pattern do we think that this is inherited in? So I'll go ahead and pause if you'd like to think about it for a minute. Okay, so the first thing we can notice is that the black wool trait cannot be dominant in this case, because here we have an individual who has the black wool trait who does not have a parent that has black wool trait. Let's go through what our expectations for a recessive are. So now we're going to imagine that the gray trait in this case, or black wool or whatever it may be, is recessive. And so before we said with the dominant that if an individual had a trait, that individual must have a parent that has a trait. So is that the case in this case? Okay, so if we have an individual affected with a recessive trait, that means the individual has inherited little a from the mother. So the mother must carry a little a, but the mother could be big A little a, in which case the mother would not be affected. And the same reasoning holds for the father. Sorry about the sirens. It's true that the individual inherited a little a from the father, but the father could also be a big A little a. And so in this case, it's not the case that if an individual is affected with a recessive trait or has a recessive trait, that one of those that individual's biological parents must have the trait. So this is different than dominant. So we can come up with one rule if we look in the opposite direction. So let's imagine we have two parents, each of which have the recessive gray trait. So that would mean that both these individuals have little a genotypes, and that these individuals thus only have little a alleles to pass down in the gametes, and so their offspring should be little a, and must be affected. Sorry, that should be gray. My apologies. So let's see if we see that in this case. Well, actually, if we look through the pedigree, we only see one mating between individuals that both have the gray trait, have the black wool, but in fact, their one offspring does have it, so it's consistent with recessive. And in fact, geneticists have worked out that the gray wool trait is in fact recessive to the white wool trait in sheep. Okay, so what have we learned? So we said that for a simple autosomal dominant trait, an individual with a trait must have a parent that has that trait, whereas for a simple autosomal recessive trait, the offspring of two individuals that have a trait must have the trait. Thanks very much.